Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So, excuse me, I'm so sorry. We're in Parshat Noach, as you can see. There we are. And we're at the point here where we are talking in the midst of the actual flood itself. And we're doing Torah Temimah, and we're speaking about before we talked about right here. Let's take a look. Um, right, we were talking about Ruach Chaim Ba'apav, anything that had the breath of life in its nostrils, and talking about the fact that that breath, breathing through the nostrils, or at least, that's an indication of being alive. So, they used to take like a mirror, I don't know if they still do, and place it at the nostrils to see if, if somebody was unconscious, then to see if they were still breathing. In that case, they'd be considered still living. And that's essentially the point that he's making here. And we were in the midst of a fairly long excursus. So I just sneezed, and that's what we were talking about. We were talking about the fact that the reason we say Gesundheit is because, at least according to the Torah, the first person who was sick before they died is Jacob. And I'm going to have to sneeze again. All right. So that in before we read about Jacob, a person would sneeze, and that would be the end of it. They would die with that sneeze. So anyway, he goes on to see here, going on, v'nafka mina bazeh. So he says there's a practical distinction, a halachic distinction, the ikar chiyuta ba'apehu, so that the main point, the main, oh gosh, uh, time when you can say a person is alive, right, is in their nostrils. Nogea, so he says that particular comment that we just had, this is what sort of got this all started, right? That the fact that a person is still considered alive as long as there's breath coming out of their nostrils. Nogea, it actually has to do the Kamenyanim, several other halachic issues. Ki ze sheyesh ruach chaim ba'apav, right? Because in a case where someone is maybe totally unconscious, but there is breath coming out of their nostrils, mechalalim alav et Shabbat, we are allowed to break the Shabbat, right? To violate the Shabbat, kamo al chai, just as we would for a living person. And he's going to go back into those sort of situations. And the point here being that we know, right, that in a case of life or death, one is allowed to violate the Shabbat. In other words, to make sure that someone survives, is able to, so for example, if they're ill and they need certain procedures or medications, etc., and it would be a matter of life and death, you're allowed to violate the Shabbat. Now, let's see what this is. Ulachain, and for this reason, mevu'ar besugya shelafanenu, it becomes clear in this Talmudic discussion that we quoted from. Here it is. He quotes from it. It's from Yoma, Tractate Yoma, page 85a. That's what he's referring to. Let's go on. Let's find it. She'im nafla mapolet al ha'adam, that if in fact a person was in a building that collapsed, that's what we're talking about. He's buried in a collapsed building. Bodkin ad chotmo, that in fact you sort of dig away until you can find his nostrils, right? You can that far you do. Im yesh bo ruach chaim, and if in fact there is breath coming out of those nostrils, mepakhin alav etagal. You're allowed to continue to remove the heap of dirt or rubble or whatever that's on him. Ve'im love, but if there is no sign of breath coming out of his nostrils, ein mefakhin. One does not do that. Uvesota, and in the tractate Sota, page 45b, Mevuar, it's clear, כשמוציאין halal בין שתי ayarot. Excuse me. When you find a body of a person, right, a dead body between two cities, you may be familiar with that particular law, and this is in case you find a body of someone and you have no idea what happened to this person and what caused them to die, right? Tzarich lahavi egla alufa, right? That one is, according in the Torah, it says one has to bring a calf, arufa. Arufa, I believe, means that it is actually killed. I believe what we're talking about is that it's struck at the back of the neck to kill it. Umodedim mimakom hachalal, and one has to measure from the place, the location of the body, el ha'ir hakrova, to the nearest city. In other words, you have to find out the closest city to where this body is located, right? And in fact, where do you measure from? Sarich limdov me'apav. One has to measure from his nostrils. Kevan deikar chiyuta ba'apavu, because the exactly what we're quoting here, right? That the ultimate source of being alive is to be found in his nostrils. The ien od bebrachot mem vav bet. He says, and look further if you want another reference. That's in Tractate Brachot, page 46b. So this is what happens is that the city, the elders of the city, essentially that is nearest, have to come and make a confession and declare that they are not responsible, and to ask God for forgiveness for the fact that this life was taken. So let's go on to the next statement. Mikol asher b'charava, from all that was on the dry land. Amar Rav Chisda, said Rav Chisda, Lo nigzera gzera al dagim shebayam, that the fish that were in the sea, excuse me, that were in the sea, were not subject to this edict of the Mabul, right, of this destructive force. Shene'emar mikol asher b'charava, because it says everything that was on the dry land, metu, they died, velo dagim shebayam. And the reason that it mentions the dry land specifically is to exclude fish that were in the oceans. Excuse me once more. All right, so let's take a look here. Tam hadavar, the reason for this, the reason that the fish were not included, I believe, is what he's referring to. Yesh lomar, one could say, pashut mishum, you could say it's clear because dichtiv ki hishchit kol basar etarko ala aretz. The reason why the fish were not subject to this punishment is because in terms of the violation, it says, all flesh was corrupt. It corrupted its way on earth. Velo ela asher b'mayim. So it would not include those that were in the waters. Omnam, however, the ikar hadavar, in the ikar, in other words, the main point of this matter, shenivdalu hadagim b'inyan zeh, that the fish were distinguished regarding this particular matter, misha'ar ba'alei chayim, from the rest of the creatures, right, living creatures. Yesh lomar, one can say, al pi ma shekatuv Tosafot, katvu Tosafot. You could say it's based on what the Tosafot wrote, but Baba Kama, in Tractate Baba Kama, page 55a, right? So Tosafot, just to clarify, were Rashi's grandsons. He did not have any sons. He had daughters who properly married scholars. And so there's this group of scholars who were his grandsons, known as the Tosafot, and their comments, they're deeply, deeply subtle and uh, complicated, difficult arguments. Very often, it's quite challenging. They also are found on a page of the Gemara on the opposite side of where the Rashi is printed. on the opposite side of the text of the Gemara, and very, very often they disagree with their grandpa, and they have very deep and insightful comments that are encyclopedic, and in many cases they deal with what would be called novellae, which refers to new laws that are inferred from the previous laws. They are so profoundly subtle and sophisticated, right? Anyway, the Tosafot say in this place, B'Shem HaYerushalmi, they quote the Jerusalem Talmud, V'chein hu b'Midrash Rabbah, and it's also stated in the Midrash Rabbah. It's Midrashim. These are extant works. The Dagim einan nirba'im. That he says now. This let's take. Okay, that fish do not do not have relations, right? Minan, to not to any species other than their own, right? That in fact they do not the point about corrupting their ways, right, is a euphemistic way of saying how people were engaging in sexual relations, which were improper. And fish don't do that. Fish do not wind up doing that kind of thing. And for this reason, mekevan shelo shachtu darcham, and because they did not corrupt their ways, right? Mimela, automatically, lo havu b'zerat hamabul. They did not come under the edict of the mabul, of the flood. Veradak, so this is David Kimchi. He's a great commentator, grammarian. Katav, he wrote, Daha dalo metu dagim shebayam, that the fact that the fish did not die, the fish in the sea didn't die, hu pashut mipnei sheikar chiyutam b'mayim. He says, it's simple enough. Their basis of being alive is in the water. That's exactly how they're alive, right? Ve'ein nireh klal. But he says, actually, this is Torah Temimah who says, it's not so clear. That he doesn't say. In fact, he says, no, that's not clear at all. That's not so obvious. Di'im haya ratzon Hashem abdu gam heim, because had it been the divine will for the fish to die as well, hayu metim gam heim, they would have died as well. Had they in fact corrupted their ways and it had been a divine decree for them to die, they would have died. It's as if, he's saying, Kimchi was saying, well, look, why? Of course they didn't die. They were living in the water. That's where fish live. They live in the water. And Torah Temimah is saying, wait a second, that isn't the reason why they didn't die. The reason they didn't die is because God decided they shouldn't die, right? V'halo b'Mitzrayim metu gam hadagim. It says regarding the plagues in Egypt, right? That the fish also died in the Nile. V'gam halashon lo nigzera gzera more behashgacha chayu, right? And he says that in saying, right, that when the Talmud or whatever says that the gzera, that the edict was not set against them, that kind of language indicates that the fact that they were alive was a divine decision, right? It was b'hashgacha, means the divine connection between the world and God. So it was due to providence, could we say, right? The fact that they were alive, the fact that it says lo nigzara gzeira, that the edict wasn't promulgated against them. V'yoter mizeh, and more than that, mochach meforash, right? It is proved quite clearly, shelo nisharu b'chayim, right? That the reason they stayed alive, right? Sorry, shelo nisharach al pi tiv'am, right? That the reason that they remained alive was simply, this is the way Kimchi is saying, is because of their nature, right? We can't say that. Sheharei kemevu'ar bereish parsha hasmucha, because we see, it's clear, right, at the beginning of the next parsha, hayu mehababul rochim. There is evident that the waters of the flood were boiling. Umatbea hadagim she'en chayim b'mayim rotkim. And umit teva hadagim, and it's certainly the nature of fish. She'en chayim b'mayim rotkim. They're not going to survive in boiling water. V'harei meforash, right? Sheba hashgacha chayu umitam shekatavnu. So it now becomes quite evident that the only reason that the fish survived is because it was a divine decree that they should survive, that they did not come under the gzera, that they should perish. V'af gamzot kasher lidvarav, and he says, he's saying this too, right, is an objection to what Kimchi wrote, right? Lama piresh Rav Chisda. Why did Rav Chisda only specify rak dagim? Why did he only specify fish? Velo gam chayot ve'ofot hayam, and he didn't include the animals and the seabirds. In other words, other animals that live in the sea and birds that are seabirds. Acharei de gam hem ikar chiyutam b'mayim, because they too, basically, they survive in the water. That's where they survive. Aval lidvarenu mevu'ar hitev. But if you look at what we're saying, according to our argument, it's very, very clear. Ki ha-tosafot Baba Kama, that Tosafot in Baba Kama that he referred to, Sham, Katvu b'shem ha-Yerushalmi, that they wrote there in the name of the Yerushalmi, citing the Yerushalmi, Dechayot ve'afot hayam, right? That in that case, remember the argument was that they corrupted their ways, right? So he says, they say, right, it was only the fish that do not corrupt the way in which they behave, right? But nizkakin l'shinan mimam. In other words, they wind up, in fact, or they wound up in that case, right, in engaging with other species. And imkain, if that's the case, shachtu gam heim darcham. In that case, we would say they too corrupted their ways. Umimela metu gam hem. And then we have to say, consequently, they too died. Kesha'ar habruim, just like the other creatures. Barak al dagim lo nigzara gzeira v'dok. He says, and we can only say that only the fish, right, were the ones who survived the flood. The fish were the only species, or kinds of species, that survived the flood. Onwards. Okay, so we are looking at the next verse. Vayimach et kol hayakum, and all of existence was wiped out, asher apne hanama, which was on the surface of the earth, me adam ad behema, from humans to cattle, ad remes, to, I think it's crawling things, ad of hashamayim, even the birds, from the creatures that crawled to the birds of the sky, Vayimachu, and they were wiped out, min haaretz, from the earth, Vayishaer ach Noach v'asher ito b'bateva, and only Noah and that which was with him in the ark remained.
So I had a question.
Sure.
So on the last section, so did the fish survive in the Nile or not? It's
No. Okay, so the Nile was a different. So we're talking about the flood, right?
right. No,
And,
I know, but they use
right.
the Nile
No,
as a
the fish.
comparison, right?
Right. The fish did not survive in the Nile.
Okay. So my question there was,
Yes.
and
Go
maybe
ahead.
it was in it.
No.
Why weren't? I mean, if they were given divine decree in the flood, what did the fish do wrong that they didn't survive in the Nile?
It wasn't a punishment for the fish. It was a demonstration of divine power to Pharaoh, remember, because
Yeah.
Pharaoh was refusing to let the Israelites go free. And so it was a whole different circumstance, where God was trying to teach the Egyptians that in their going against God's divine decree, that there were consequences as a result of it. And so in that text there in Exodus, which we have been reading now over the last couple
Right.
of weeks, right? It's clear, God says it very clear that he wanted the Egyptians and even the Israelites to see and understand how powerful the divine is, and that human resistance to the divine power ultimately is fruitless. I think that's the point. And so God was going to do whatever was means necessary to do that, because at least let's say from a biblical perspective, and it's just one model, right? It isn't the only model, that we need to see how the universe, or at least what we experience in reality, is like a prepared table for us. That all these things, it's a way of viewing it, to see that these are things that we should appreciate and care for deeply. That nature, all the things that are around us, whether it's the animals or the trees or anything, is really there because God wants us to be able to survive and in fact thrive, and to appreciate these things as ultimately coming from a divine source. And as I said, if we do in fact look at it that way, then it becomes our responsibility to act as stewards, and to take care of these things that were created for our sake, right? So that's so in this particular case, that's why the animals in the case of Egypt and the plagues were destroyed, like the animals were destroyed by the hail. There was a cattle disease. There were all those kinds of things, ways in which God was trying to tell Pharaoh, and the Egyptians, this that what they were doing in refusing to let the Israelites be released from slavery and be free to worship God was going to have terrible consequences. Now, the case
So
of it was universal, but the case of Pharaoh wasn't. So, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. You want to make a point?
yeah, so I guess what you're saying is that the demonstration of that power in Egypt would outweigh the innocence of the animals,
Correct.
that were being sacrificed, which is a different circumstance than what we're talking about with the okay.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Okay, I
Yes.
get it. Okay,
Yes.
thank
Right.
you.
Okay. No, it's great. I'm glad it's a wonderful question you asked. So thank you. I'm so glad you did. Right.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. All right. Let's try and see if we can catch another one here. Okay. Vayimach, right? They were wiped out. Amar Rabbi Ami, said Rabbi Ami, Kol ha'ochel me'afara shel Bavel, anyone who eats, this is from the dust literally, right, of Babylonia. Ki'ilu ochel mi basar avotav. This is terrible, I have to say. Oh God. It's like they can he's saying basically it's like it's like being a cannibal, right? Literally means of the flesh of his forebears. Wow. Phew. That's pretty heavy going here. Let's take a look. Okay. Why is he saying this? He's saying mimei tehamabul because the ones who died, the perished in the flood, right, basically were gathered there. Usfirale, and he holds, that is, Rabbi Ami is holds, the Commander Amar Bezvachim, who, like the opinion that's held in the Tractate Zvachim, page 113b, right? The Be'eretz Yisrael lo yarad hamabul. There's an opinion that said that the flood did not affect the land of Israel. Israel was not affected by the flood. Uma shetafas Bavel yoter mi'admat kol ha'olam. And the reason why he holds on to Babylonia, right? Why does he mention specifically Babylonia more than any other land, right, in the world? Shenitba bamabul, right? So, right, anyone in the who were drowned in the flood. Tzarich lomar, you have to say al pi ma shekatuv b'zvachim sham, that is written in the tractate Zvachim there. Delachchen nikra'u Bavel b'shem Shinar, that the reason why Babylonia is also known as Shinar, right? Na'er is like to shake something, right? The na'er. Al Shem, and the reason is shekol meitei hamabul nin aru sham. See, there's this word na'ur, that all those that perished in the flood were shaken there. In other words, they were shaken out of the rest of the world and wound up in Babylonia. V'habi'ur hu mipnei, and the further explanation is mipnei shehi amuka. The reason is that Babylonia is a low area, ma'od. It's a very low area. V'lachen nikret gam b'shem metzula. So it's also known. I'm trying to think of how we would call metzula. It's like a depression, right? Kamosha Katuv Yeshayahu, as is written in the book of Isaiah, Mem Dalet, chapter 44. Haomer Letzula Charavi. Something, okay, so this is a quote that it says, one who says Letzula Charve. I would need to look this up, what this quote is. Because charav could mean dry, something like that. So I will need to double check and next time get back to you on that. Iyen sham b'mefarshim, he says, take a look there at the biblical commentators. The imkain, right? And if this is the case, afara shel Bavel, the soil of Babylonia, be'emet really is shku'ah mimite hamabul, right? I think what it means is it's sort of penetrated by the people who died in the flood, yoter mikol haolam, more than anywhere else in the world. Uchlal inyan achilat afar. So, okay, of course, people don't actually eat soil, right? He says, and of course, to understand generally what is meant by this phrase achilat afar, kafi de mashmag begamara, it's as is implied in the Gemara, ire bechol lerifua. Oh, okay, excuse me, I have to back up. He is talking literally about consuming soil because he's saying one might consume the soil as a treatment, as medicine. So the way Torah Temimah is understanding this is not sort of metaphorically, but literally that what Rabbi Ami is talking about is quite literally eating from the soil of Babylonia. So we are in the middle of this, right? Notice this is in the middle of this comment, and we're going to have to stop here, but we'll go back next time we do this, and I will take a close look and review what we did and make sure that we understand what's going on here. So, okay, let's take a look here, and I'm going to stop the share. Okay, there we are. Any comments before
Yeah, I was wondering about the fish.
Yes.
You have crocodiles and you have octopuses
Yes.
and other things in the water that live in the water.
Mhm.
Were they died too?
Well, you see, alligators also live essentially on the land too. I think they do a lot of hunting. So again, we have to be careful, that we're talking more in generalities. So octopi do not live outside water. They are dependent on the water. I guess they have a gill system, right? They're able to
Yes.
extract the oxygen in the water and are able to survive. By the way, one reason why fish would not survive in boiling water is that when you boil water, you release the oxygen in the water so that there's no oxygen left. So,
Right.
so it just all it does is support Torah Temimah's notion and the original notion that the reason why the fish survived was because God wanted them to survive. God decided they would survive. It was all
Okay.
based on divine law.
Yeah, what about
Alligators, I don't think so. Yes. Yeah.
on it? What about Israel? He saved
Yes.
Israel. What
Yes.
about the people in there, like the Canaanites and
Very
so forth?
good. Oh, that's a wonderful question, Arlen. I do not know. And it may at that particular time, I don't know that Canaanites were there because we read also that the Canaanites, this is in the Bible, it's clear that the Canaanites were not the original inhabitants of that land. Okay.
Who was?
Yeah, they were early inhabitants, probably Semites, descendants of Shem who lived there and were just, were basically destroyed by the Canaanites. They also entered that area. It's a piece of territory that has been conquered and by many, many peoples.
Mm.
So yeah. So whatever it was that they did, so we could say, based on your question, that those particular people somehow survived. I guess we could sort of try and play it out, but they themselves were subsequently destroyed in later generations.
Oh,
But
yeah.
on the other hand, we could take the Torah at its word and say that the only people who were left were Noah and his family and the animals that were on the ark, and that we have to just understand that while these people who lived there didn't perish in the flood, nevertheless they perished. So, for some reason or another. Or it was uninhabited at the time. I mean, we could say that. There's several ways in which to try to, answer the question. So, thank you. No, it's a very good question.
I have two
Yes.
two things. One is
Sure,
one
sure.
is just a minor correction.
Okay.
Um, it's octopuses technically. I
Oh,
mean, people
really?
say octopi, but it's a Greek ending, not a Latin ending,
Okay.
which makes it octopuses. But because people, it's like irregardless. Because people say it, it's
Yeah.
going to be shown now in the dictionary as a possible
Yes.
plural, but it's not actually technically correct.
Okay.
But
Good.
the thing about fishes surviving, um, God wanted them to survive. You kind of implied that they were not going against God's will or behaving
Correct.
or,
It's quite
but
explicitly. Yes.
I mean, I mean, I could be wrong, but I thought according to theology that animals, and this I don't think is true, but theologically speaking, I thought animals in general couldn't rebel because they have a given nature, and whatever they do, whether we can spin it in a way that we think it's immoral, because for instance dolphins gang rape, but it's that part of their way of propagation, and we can see it as violent and sexist and whatever we want to see, but it's dolphin nature to act in a certain way, and that's the way they were created. There are animals that learn, and there are animals that use tools and do things and all kinds of things that we didn't know they could do, including dolphins crawling up on land, octopus is one of the most brilliant animals, and they can do all kinds of things, and they do have some ability, I think, to breathe air because they've lived for a long time if they're captured and they're trying to get back to the water. But generally I think that if you want to say a difference between animals and people and other animals is that people have choices, and that again is all debatable. Um, if the animals technically act according to their nature and can't say, I'd like to do something against my nature now, and how could they be punished for
Okay.
being
So I'm going to answer the question. Again, this is why it's helpful to see this material as literature. So that when we hold it up to history or hold it up to nature or the way things are, it's not always going to work. It's more, what is it trying to teach us? In other words, that's why we talk about fiction, right? We have this concept of fiction. Why, if fiction is lying, if we're going to look at fiction as nothing but a bunch of imaginary lies, why read it? But the truth is that very often fiction is able to express ideas and thoughts that go far beyond simply a scientific explanation of things. And in this particular case, While nowadays it's true, we would say that in general, animals are programmed, and so they aren't going to do these kinds of things. We're saying that for the sake of the story and for the sake of the of some of the deeper points that the Torah is trying to teach us, right? They did in this story. And in some ways, the message here is that when you engage in this kind of sexual behavior, it has profound effects. And so by saying that the animals too, this is Tosafot's opinion, right? That the reason why the animals were killed, it's a one opinion, and it's according to Tosafot, is because they also corrupted the way. It says all flesh corrupted its ways. And we just have to take it for what it's worth in the story, you know, and not try to say, well, is this scientifically true, et cetera, et cetera. Because you're right, Lauren. I wouldn't argue with your point, and I'm one who also said that to such an extent animals are programmed, right? I mean, we know that dogs sometimes will, they're just so certain type species of dogs, male dogs, are so hypersexed, they'll have sex with anything practically, right? But I don't believe that's necessarily true of other animals, and I don't feel I need to believe that. But I do want to understand what the Torah is trying to get across to us. And in looking, that's why, you hear me say so often that we need to look at this more as like a historical novel. That, do I believe there was a Moses? Do I believe there was an Abraham? Do I believe there was an Isaac or a Jacob? I do. It doesn't stretch my credulity that much in any way, actually, to say such people existed and that they left us with, some profound lessons that apply even today. So, but I appreciate the point you're making. And if you want to respond to what I'm saying, you're welcome. You know that. You're muted, Lauren. Lauren, we can't hear you because you're muted.
If you look at Balaam's donkey or the
Yes,
talking snake
exactly.
in the Garden of Eden, that's obvious that that's
Right.
mythological and is meant to teach
Yeah.
a lesson. But you know, in the text, it just says, it destroyed everything on land, and it would make sense that
Right.
fish didn't die from more water because they live in water.
I know.
But to add that the fish were singled out for behaving better than other animals, it doesn't seem like to me that's just a matter of, well, there's some elements that are not historically or scientifically or whatever accurate, because that actually wasn't in the text, but they're just looking for a reason, and that they are, I know, looking to teach a lesson, but I don't know. I mean, it teaches the wrong lesson to some people when you hear things like that.
I hear where you're coming from. I know. It's a very complicated issue.
Uh,
Okay. It's really not one that I feel comfortable getting into at this particular point.
yeah, but Rabbi, animals have instincts only. Instincts. They have this
Well,
instinct,
this is the point that Lauren was trying to make, and this is what I was
and humans have, choices, good
right.
or bad.
Well,
Well,
I'm saying that both of those statements are theologically accurate, but I'm not sure that either one of them is actually accurate. I'm not sure that animals only operate by instinct and nature, and that human beings have any more choice than any other animal.
You're
well,
probably right. I don't know.
I mean, but we're talking about the theological interpretation of the separation between people and animals, and that's a big part of it. So
Yeah.
why mess with it,
okay.
particularly?
I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to further comment. I'm going to stop the recording. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Let's do
Oh,
this.
by the way, the groundhog found his shadow.
Which
Good.
means what?
6 more weeks of cold winter.
I
Ooh.
guess I'll stop the recording at that point then.